Back during community college, there were two anime that had similarities with one another, Tokyo Ghoul and Parasite. I enjoyed the latter, but I always viewed the former as the more popular and dare I say better show in terms of pacing. But it turns out, both the fanbase of the manga and even the casual audience for the show leaned towards Parasite in the end. Even if Tokyo Ghoul is still going strong to this day, they just couldn't stomach the animated version. My point is that some shows that premiered for a short period of time can still retain a familiar consensus, appreciating its established world, characters, and lore. But it feels like mediums with this admiration the most are anime, comics, cult live-action films, or miniseries. Cartoons seem to get the short end of the stick. If it had an inconvenient time slot, a sloppy production committee, or was overshadowed by the rise of cable and cinematic adaptations, you could just expect it to fade away to obscurity. One of those shows was 1999's Redwall. In hindsight, Redwall the book was published in '86, and although gaining a dedicated fanbase across the years, it never seemed to take off into pop culture, even during the show's public circulation. And after the author's death in 2011, the books have fallen into a deeper niche. I started going through the books, art, interviews, and there is so much information to explain, analyze, and extrapolate. So to avoid giving everyone severe spoilers, this will be the first of two videos. This right here will be a more digestible and spoiler-free review, while the second will be an in-depth, no-holds-barred exploration on its production and execution. But for now though, I hope to explain why I think this forgotten gem should be consumed for future reference and adaptation with the utmost respect. To give background on what the Redwall universe even is, its tales follow various characters who are based on woodland animals, living on the not Britain Isles. You might follow a young mouse in one book, which is every season of this show, but in another, you join a young badger trying to find his place in the world, some squirrels hunting for their freedom, or an otter reclaiming her kingdom. Redwall Abbey itself is usually a major or specific part of the stories, sitting in the middle of Mossflower Woods, being an important route for trade and transport, where many travelers or settlers gather to tell each other tales. While they're usually related to Redwall Abbey, their adventures span both space and time, expanding myths into legends, with that being the charm in Brian Jake's storytelling. You can read any of the 22 books without requiring any previous knowledge of the lore or characters, this being one of the reasons it gained traction from young readers compared to something like the Warriors Cat series by Aaron Hunter, whose books followed long-running arcs in a mostly chronological epic, and even J.R.R. Tolkien, creating The Hobbit, Silmarillion, and Lord of the Rings as main stories with the essential lore while publishing novellas outside of those. The only link to Redwall's loose narrative is the simple A Tale of Redwall beneath each title. They are essentially early 20th century comic strips you can read in any fashion. The miniseries is divided into 3 seasons covering 3 books. The miniseries started its run in Europe during 1999, then crossed the pond to premiere on more than 200 American stations after near completion back home in 2001, being funded by numerous stations and committees in the UK, France, Canada, and US. It was confirmed that a 4th season would be prepared, only for it to be grounded due to financial reasons even with its good reception. Season 1 follows Redwall, the very first story, about a young mouse named Matthias who takes a large role in defending the eponymous abbey against a seizure of rats while solving the mystery of their treasured sword's disappearance. Season 2 covers Matameo, a sequel to the first with Matthias' son of the title's name. He and his fellow young woodlanders struggle to survive and attempt multiple escapes from a band of slave traders, while Matthias forms a party to hunt them down. Finally, Season 3 depicts Martin the Warrior, the original defender of Redwall, unveiling his upbringing and rise to legend on a moral mission to reclaim his father's sword from a band of forced slavers that imprisoned and worked him through the course of his life. Books 1, 3, and 6 in that order, all simple yet fun stories thanks to the players. I would describe the cast as having distinct personalities but basic character traits. This doesn't mean they're boring, however, thanks to the cast of actors with at least some knowledge of the English dialect, for a Canadian voice acting project at least, and to the scriptwriters being near faithful to Jake's material.
That is Martin the Warrior. He founded our order.
And if he were here today, he'd chop you up for crow's meat.
What do we do with them? Send them in first?
No, please! We'll be killed!
Stop sniveling, you vile vermin!
Why don't I finish him off now and save us a lot of trouble?
Vich is a newcomer, a guest in our abbey. You were born here and should know better.
He said I wasn't a warrior. Well, I am!
Shame on you, Matameo! You shame your father and your mother. Go to your father Immediately. Let him deal with you.
You greasy stinkers!
Get your damn claws in him!
Language? If your mother could hear you.
Good shot, eh?
You just killed him. I mean...
Young one. It's called war. You'd best give those to me if you can't use them.
Listen to me carefully, daughter. This Martin, you must never let yourself grow too close to him.
What are you talking about?
He is a warrior, Rose, and death walks alongside him.
The Redwall universe is a bustling community full of energy and heart. Think of the original Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, or even Xenoblade Chronicles. Characters are close-knit creatures that bounce off each other's personalities. Most of the animal species vaguely represent fantasy races, creatures, classes, or roles. For example, Season 1. We have Matthias, the protagonist and Dirtagonist, following Season 1 and 2 respectively. A happy kid with a sad upbringing who we follow as he grows up into a leader. Our hair-boxing ranger, Basil's Staghair, charged risk-taker and uplifting scout who adapts to tension as the series progresses. Constance, Badger Mother of Redwall, a ferocious tank with strategy to match, who is always there to support Matthias and for him to deliver on said support. Formole, leader of the jolly dwarf-like moles, hearing for danger and constantly rebuilding while lifting everybody's spirits with their old East Somerset accents. Jess, motherly squirrel of Silent Sam, both tree-hop and rogues. And finally, Cornflower, cook and head of nursing who has time to scold the gang for lack of morale. These are the ones we see primarily in the series that I felt attached to as the mains are reoccurring, until the third season has us going back to Martin's beginnings. You can see how they cover several fantasy tropes, but never so closely as to follow the expected pigeonhole. But enough of the goodies, the villains don't need to hide behind the curtain. Though more modern stories try to create baddies as sympathetic and or rational beings, Redwalls might be empathetic, rational, or insane freaks. Clooney, a hardened warlord who cracks under the weight of failure as the nightmares of Martin continue to haunt him. Slagar is just Tim Curry with a plan with the madness to accomplish it. Let's just say it isn't space. Badring and Clog have a winner-take-all rivalry when the former slaves plan out escapes, traps, and sieges under his nose. Their rivalry is so engaging it possibly overshadows Martin's impact on the narrative. So overall, Slagar, Trum and Clog, and Asmodeus are my favorite villains. One indulges on his dreams of total revenge, one lives life to the fullest in the laziest way imaginable, and last is just a terrifying force of nature with sentience.
I will show you eternity.
Redwall's villains are where Brian Jake's creativity is easiest to see. While Slagar and Batarang did get some of their kills scrubbed out or altered, Clooney was just too hardcore in the book to be properly portrayed in the cartoon, and the extended runtime made him sort of a big Saturday morning villain.
They've defeated me with porridge!
Some of his acting was questionable also, but I really appreciate the scriptwriter's effort to convey everyone's tenacity with some decently graphic dialogue or dark humor, even for the good guys.
Gorad, you nimwit! You were supposed to kill Clog, not let that slimy sea rat kill you! Ah!
Poison.
I'll back me bucko. You were supposed to kill Badrang, not get yourself done in.
One of those stout fellas didn't make it. Either he thought he could fly, or he missed his paw hold. Ugh! Stumbling across him nearly put me off my supper, it did. I say, chaps, what is for supper?
We killed them all, good and proper.
But with all the pieces in place, we need a story and lead to pave its landscape. The first two episodes are near cinema-worthy in terms of direction, music, ambience, writing, and character exploration. Matthias in the original book was an abandoned baby left outside the Abbey gates. But Steve Roberts and Brian Jakes himself made an original backstory for him as a victim of pillaging under Clooney the Scourge as he travels across the land, giving us over 6 minutes of a soundtrack-filled but minimally voiced introduction as he gazes up on the tapestry depicting Mossflower's history, while struggling to forget those memories. But Clooney's rise, declaration for the Abbey's surrender, and the voice of the ancient hero Martin in his head brings out the ferocity in him.
Matthias. 4.
I am
Who dares challenge? Who dares challenge Clooney the Scourge shall perish!
Now you rats listen to me. I'll tell you what you get. You get nothing, nothing, nothing!
His mixing of original and adapted scenes brings out a tragedy to his character. You could be in his shoes or witness events alongside him. Outside of those episodes, his call to action as a wide-eyed kid who has things fly over his head molds him into a youthful tactician and witty fighter that could still be consumed by anger and suspicion, but learns to control it with the help of his allies and Martin's constant repetition of guidance. And seeing him as a young adult in Season 2 to midlife years in Season 3 really brings out a long emotional arc that most cartoons don't cover in honest execution.
I'll find you, Matty. If it takes the rest of my life, I will find you.
He's just a really cool character for a heroic medieval epic. The only issue with him are parts of his performance in Matameo, given it's the same voice actor who played him as a child, and he's directed to act more monk-like, and how his family past is never brought up again. It would be nice if, like many other parts of the series, they could have called back to it. That being said, it's a personal tragedy that started his character on its journey, and as he grew up, he was able to move on. He found a new home and family to fight for. With guidance from his leaders and mentors, he learns to fight not out of vengeance for a few lost souls, but for justice of Woodlanders under the Redwall banner. With Matameo, while the era of Matthias was more of a simple dance of good versus evil, this time the formula is mixed up into a Homer-esque adventure. Season 3 is presented as a tale more potent after seeing the first two, in my opinion. I would love to get further into the plot, but I feel like I can't give it the service it deserves. But it's a story worth checking out for the conflicting villains, lore, and motivations, even if you had to fit in with a new cast. The series just has something for everyone, in a true sense. Say like a Don Bluth film. Even the designs bring some new aesthetics to mind, minus the animation, which I think is the Achilles heel. Its script was consistent, but the animatics, keyframes, and action scenes leave a lot to be desired. It couldn't show much gore or weapon impacts for the sake of visual guidance by the networks. Yet Redwall was animated by Nelvana, a Canadian studio with plenty of merit in the 80s, until they shifted interest into more licensed children projects by their producers after Rock and Rule flopped. The animation was an awkward hybrid of traditional animation and digital coloring, for the sake of handling a rough workflow with multiple adaptation deals and new creative talent, while moving into a new age of animation. They used Animo, a Cambridge animation system software that would later be bought by Toon Boom to implement in their own product. It basically scanned keyframes and model sheets so editors could have more leeway in smoothing out sketches, digital color, and map models onto vectors, or half-done animatics to simplify the workflow. So is this traditionally hand-drawn or digitally animated? Yes. While characters were software colored and sometimes applied shadow or glow effects, the backgrounds were beautifully painted with hints of watercolor that follow close to Chris Baker's interior illustrations for the German and British publicated novels. After doing astounding concept designs and storyboards for Stanley Kubrick or Tim Burton films, he just became a creative consultant that approved the character models for Redwall, which have a very appealing blend of human and animal characteristics. I think what helped was the smaller irises compared to the original art, not as fluent or cartoonish as Nim's, but more rounded. But sadly, the new team with the new software led to sometimes a very mediocre presentation. Specifically, the action set pieces, repeating frames, time interpolation, odd coloring, and multiples of the same model, even reusing ones of dead characters.
They'll burn the abbey! What shall we do?
At least it vastly improved over the course of the series. Season 1 had the aforementioned shadows and glows, but Season 2 and onwards never went that excessive again, thanks to a less saturated color palette and more traditional presentation. The most beautiful pieces of the show are its tapestry art depicting scenes that happen during and before an episode. No narration, just visuals and a rendition of the main track that brings out the theme of history being forever recorded. However, without the story editors, screenplay, and Brian Jake's pulse on the writers, this wouldn't have been worth watching, especially for a presentation. And the team was aware of that. Even if most of the violence is axed out, the workaround was to imply through fast cuts to not display impacts, and then add on to the context with reaction shots, sound effects, and music, even just showing the body. I commend them for trying to convey so much tension and consequence with such a strict work limitation. But even with all these positives, some of the visual alterations or errors were so odd that it pulled me out of the experience a few times, which made the missed chance of an even bigger and better season all the more depressing, thanks to the US not wanting to fund it. Recall the moment I included music as a key factor? Duo composers Jack Pocher and Daniel Fernandez created a more classical fantasy score rather than an over-the-top chorus of noise that supersedes the scenes it's used in. While a few tracks were a bit too light for my liking, the variety of instruments and its use of ambience to build excitement helped me with its more mature direction here and there, especially with the track Medieval. If there was ever a film This would make a perfect piece. It has slow and quiet drums, lute, and horns that progress into a high crescendo of snares with an iconic flute. The main theme is just a magnum opus of cartoon openings too. Melancholic brass, woodwinds, tambourines moving to low, groggy strings, trumpets, and drums. Climaxing with a triumphant fanfare and back to the beginning is already a musical epic before watching a new episode. Now, at the end of our journey, why did Redwall never take off? It had a close-knit fanbase from the books, was on a couple hundred stations. From anecdotal experiences, the fault is mostly the strict time slot on nearly every station it aired on. A show can be amazing, but if it's on just before or during school, no child will think to catch up with it. George Shrinks and Seven Little Monsters had a better chance. It's kinda funny. I watched this back when I was roughly 7 years old and never recalled it after season 2. Lacking any cable, Fox Kids and the WB pulled the plug, so I had nothing but PBS for passing the time with my younger brothers and sisters until I was in my late teens. But I wish I could have had something like Avatar to experience in my youth. What dramatic irony to discover that there was something like that right under my nose when I couldn't even read or speak properly. So I don't find myself enveloped in rose-tinted nostalgia for this series, I think. Redwall is a show made by a team with restrictions for visual presentation, chaotic time slots on mostly public stations targeted for new or general entertainment for learning, and an inevitable shift in said public television space. Sadly, it got half buried, but that visible half is noticeable and there's still a pulse on it. It has a blend of thematic presentation with semi-episodic runtime, the 2 later seasons following more faithfully to its charming yet serious source material, simple yet endearing characters for young and old viewers that aren't looked down upon despite its good versus bad routine, and a very rational script for a medieval fantasy epic despite it being on stations for 7-year-olds when it should be for teens. Forgive my redundancy. My friend who is an Avatar loyalist said something like this. Redwall did the best it could as a miniseries in the twilight years of 80s and 90s written cartoons, as the medium shifted to a new millennia. To not compare it or place it alongside something like Avatar, Samurai Jack, or even Batman the Animated Series is a disingenuous disservice to what it was trying to achieve despite the medium's evolution in the industry. Me personally, it succeeded. Maybe with multiple cuts on its knees, but it earned itself a nice 4-pint mug of ale.
We stay up here till they come back.
Well, that's it. I finally made a video after a long time. I've been doing a bit better, and Redwall and a few other cartoons really helped me out a bit. Sadly, these kind of been better than the past cartoons I watched like Steven Universe, Star, Gravity Falls, but I still appreciate those for what they were. Hopefully any of the clicks and messes weren't that big and severe. It's hard for me to be more motivated to just talk like a YouTuber at least, but I think I got a decent voice. A moist one, if you might say. So I hope this simple introduction enticed you to go watch Redwall, or dive into the book series at least. If you're interested in watching it, I highly recommend doing it with friends. How about in my Discord group?
But I thought, well, you know, if you have made somebody happy with your writings, you know, and give somebody like a little bit of comfort or in the dark times and they read the book, you know, it's a little bit of an incentive to them or a little bit of happiness for them, you know, because he's growing up and one day he'll be a child of our age, won't he? You know, and I always like to think that kids of our age, it'd be terrible if we grew up all together. We must carry a little bit of childhood in their time.